Welcome to Fulcrum Democracy Forum. I'm Ugo Balta, Executive Editor with the Fulcrum, a daily cross-partisan news publication that engages citizens in evolving government to better meet the needs of all people. To that end, we strive to share many perspectives to widen our readers' viewpoints. For this episode, I'm joined by John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. John leads AAJC's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy, advocacy, education, and litigation. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you very, very much for having me here.
Tell us about advancing the civil and human rights of the U.S.'s fastest growing racial group and AAJC's work in building and promoting a fair and equitable society for all.
Sure. And first, it might be useful to understand the Asian American community here in the United States a little bit more. So, as you said, it's one of our fastest growing communities. Between 2000 and the 2020 census, we've grown about a little bit over 80%. So now we're about 23 million Americans here in the United States. That represents about 7% of the U.S. population. So the growth has been tremendous. At the same time, it's important to remember that our community is really quite diverse. It includes over 100 different languages. It includes over 50 different races and ethnicities. So just what we call Asian American is also important to remember. So where AAJC, my organization, fits into this is, as you said, we fight for the civil rights of our community, but then also to try to create a fair and equitable society for all. So what we try to do is we advocate for our community, we educate about our community, and we empower our community. So when I say advocate, we're an organization based in DC. So we work with Congress, we work with the presidential administration on policies that affect the Asian American community. Whether it's around immigration, whether it's around voting, whether it's around census, technology, racial profiling. Those are typical issues. Anti-Asian hate, unfortunately, has been very big in the last few years. Then we also will educate. And what I mean by that is precisely what we're doing here. Talk about who the Asian American community is. Dispel some of the narratives that are myths, such as the model minority myth, the notion that we're doing better than the average American, such as the perpetual foreigner, the notion that we are not part of America, that we're not really belong here, but rather we're foreigners that people should be suspicious of. And then we try to empower our own community. Because as you might imagine, with any newer community, and we are a newer community, the needs are different. Our community is about 70% immigrant. In other words, they actually came from a different country. Over 90% of our community are immigrants or children of immigrants. So whether it's language needs, whether it's social service needs, whether it's basic educational needs, that's what we try to address for our organization.
I really appreciate you taking the time in regards to unpacking the depth of the Asian American community, because too often Asian Americans, myself, I self-identify as a Hispanic Latino. Non-Asian Americans, non-Hispanic Latinos often view other groups as a monolith. And obviously, as you stated, it's anything but. One of the things that also comes up, especially in this particular political environment that we're living in, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. As someone who's a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, and I've certainly spoken about not only leveraging the nuances of the Hispanic Latino community, but also what we have in common with all people, and I think for myself, I live in Chicago, and I walk down my street, I have Latino neighbors, African American neighbors, white neighbors, and I think while we have things that are unique to ourselves, beginning with ethnic background, there's also a lot that we have in common. I'd like to hear your thoughts in regards to DEI from the prism of your organization, the Asian American community, and the current political climate that we're in.
Sure. And I think there's a couple of things that should be said about DEI. First is, unfortunately, the term DEI has become politicized, and that's something that I think we all need to address. Because I think if you ask the average American, and we've done polling on this, and the polling supports this, people in America, regardless of political stripe, supports diversity. People in America supports equity, making sure that everyone gets a fair shake in this society. People in America all agree that we want to be inclusive of each other. So those three words standing alone, everyone's actually in agreement with. But when we put them together, somehow at times it becomes politicized. And so I think for us as an organization, and when we talk to our community and all of our sort of different communities around us, is making sure we understand, well, what do these terms mean and why this is actually a good thing, right? We could debate about policies around that. That's a different conversation. But let's start by sort of talking about what DEI represents. Um, and in that context, I think the Asian American community, it's useful to understand it because we're a microcosm in some ways of the United States as a whole. Just as the United States as a whole is a collection of different types of identities that form a greater unity here in the United States. Likewise, within the Asian American community, like you identified, like any other community, it's we have our own diversity. So how do we put it together? I think when I talk about DEI and when I think about it, the other thing that I always want to go back to is sort of what the vision of America is. Sometimes people, when they talk about America, they think of us as a melting pot. And I understand the analogy, and I appreciate that it's meant to be positive. That we come to the United States, we come together and become this greater collective within this pot called America. My difficulty with that analogy is that it requires each of us to melt a little bit, give away a little bit of ourselves in order to become this group. My analogy would be that we are more like a tossed salad. It's not as sexy of an idea, but it's the notion that like each of us have our individual personalities, individual identities, whether it is Chinese American as I am, whether it's Mexican American, whether it's African American from Nigeria or Lagos. We don't need to give that up, but then when we come together within that context of a tossed salad, that salad tastes much better with the tomatoes, with the lettuce, with the carrots, with the olives, if you like olives, rather than just as individual pieces, right? And so for us at AHAC, when we think about our DEI work, it's through that prism of like, how do we recognize that our individuality is actually a strength that makes America better?
I agree with you 100%, and I appreciate the analogy of a tossed salad. I think what in what you're talking about, it's about assimilation versus acculturation, and many in this country believe that assimilation is the path to success, while different communities, including my own, look at acculturation as the path forward because you are adopting what is best of the American experience and retaining what's best of whether the country that you've immigrated from or where you traced your roots. So I certainly that certainly resonates with me. One of the things that you've mentioned in regards to the Asian American community is how large the immigration community is within that community itself. In December, AHAC endorsed reintroducing the Reuniting Families Act, legislation that would promote family unity in the country's immigration system, reduce the family-based immigration backlogs, and update our laws to reflect how families immigrate to the United States. Tell us more about legislation to promote family unity in the United States immigration system.
Sure. So the family immigration system has been a cornerstone of our American immigration system since the 1960s as a formal matter. But even before that legislation, most of us came to the United States through different family connections. Obviously, the experience was very, very different for African Americans or Africans that came here as slaves that then became Americans. Very different experience for Native Americans. But other than those populations, most of us, in some ways, and I should exclude also the Mexican population that has been indigenous to the United States, but most of us came to the United States through these different means. The reality also is that that family immigration system at this point is a little bit broken. Because of different backlogs, because of different limits that have been put on it, and because of, in some ways, the politicization of the system, we recognize there needs to be an overhaul. And that's what the Reuniting Families Act really does. It's been proposed in different Congresses. For the first time in many, many years, it was introduced on the Senate side by Senator Mazie Hirono, as well as being introduced on the House side by Representative Judy Chu. And so what this really does is recognize the value of family. and that in itself has merit. That we shouldn't just be talking about high skilled jobs. We shouldn't just be talking about classes of people, but to recognize the intrinsic value of having your parents over here to help take care of your kids so you can run a small business. Having a brother or sister come over here to help you run that and expand that business. It's in our economic interest in the United States to have that system, right? And not to limit the types of immigrants that come to the United States.
Two things come to mind as I was listening to your answer. One, the role that media plays in providing one-dimensional narratives about complex issues like immigration, and also um, identity. You mentioned again, and we talked about how Asian Americans, Latinos, Hispanics are not a monolith, but in mainstream media, it is often caricatures of who a person is or a community is. And the same thing happens with immigration. The truth of the matter is a majority of people who are undocumented in the United States didn't cross through the southern border. They came here legally, and because of some of that bureaucracy and backlog, became undocumented. President-elect Donald Trump has said he plans on mass deportation, and as a response to the fractured immigration policies and existing what exists in our country today. In regards to the path forward and the rhetoric that's coming from the president-elect, any thoughts from AHAC's standpoint in regards to what is best in solving for this fractured issue?
Yeah, I think the first starting point is recognizing that immigration is in the United States' best interest. And this notion of the United States being invaded by foreigners or by undocumented immigrants is a narrative that luckily there is the media that is helping us to understand that narrative and push back against that narrative, but more needs to be done there. The reality is the United States needs immigrants. We need more immigrants, right? And yes, we need to update our laws, and there are certain pieces of that law that are broken, and that's what we need to talk about, right? As to sort of what type, if you want to talk about what types of immigrants, that's fine, but to demonize them as a whole or suggest that somehow that is weakening America, I think that's the starting point, is to talk about that. The other piece is to humanize it. This is one of those situations where, on one level, if you ask Americans, even in rural areas or so-called red state areas, that say our immigration system is broken, if you ask them about immigrants living in their neighborhood, they'll say, "Yeah, hey, they're wonderful people. They contribute to our community. I know that dry cleaner at the corner of my street. I know that restaurant owner. I love what they do." So maybe if they understand that many of them, maybe their immigration status when they came here was a little bit questionable, but their contribution actually to the United States is so great. And so how do we legitimize that? How do we normalize that in some ways? Yeah.
Yeah, and look, and I agree with you. I think the the country needs the immigrant population, beginning with the economic growth.
Right.
It's just whether it's Main Street, whether it's looking at the agricultural industry, immigrants are the backbone of many of those industries, and absolutely necessary. And I think you're also right. Too often, this community is spoken about, but not spoken to, let alone heard from. So you're right. When you have conversations about different communities and their experience with immigrants, documented or not, it's very different than the what we're hearing from elected officials that too often are using the most vulnerable for their own political agenda. We off camera we're talked about I live in Chicago. I'm originally from the Northeast, but you grew up in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area. You have been a leader in the Asian American and Pacific Islander and broader civic community for many years. Your experiences include serving in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Tell us about your upbringing, where you grew up, and who and what inspires the work that you do today.
For that question, because that's why sort of when we talk about immigration, it is very personal to me, right? I am not only an immigrant, I actually was at one point an undocumented immigrant, as some would call it, an illegal alien, right? And it wasn't until bipartisan legislation in 1986 by Ronald Reagan that I had that path to citizenship called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So for me, this is deeply personal because I didn't become a citizen until I was an adult. Uh, and at the same time, even though I was undocumented, I would challenge anyone that would push me on this is that I would like to think that I have been a contribution to society. And you mentioned that I had the privilege of serving in the Obama administration. I served our government in representing our government in trade negotiations with China, with Japan, with Korea. And I think that was a net benefit to the United States to have someone with my background, my language capabilities, to help unnavigate that system, figure out where we might be able to come to agreements. So the idea that we should shut our borders based on arbitrary lines or concerns about vague concerns about suspicions about different countries or who might be perceived as an adversary is very short-sighted. So in terms of my upbringing, that's where I start from is that immigrant community. Uh, my role models obviously are my parents. Just and like I said, I was undocumented at one point, and it was their courage to decide to stay here when we fell out of status. So to your point, we came here on work visa, so we came here legally. But then at a certain point, my father was unable to renew that work visa, and they made the difficult decision to stay in the United States because that they knew that that would be better for my brother and me, and they knew that we could do what we can to live the American dream. Um, and so a part of what I do now, I feel like, is to pay back both my parents and my community in terms of the sacrifices that they made, but then also recognizing the difficulties that they faced. As immigrants with limited English capabilities at times, I saw how whether it was the legal system, whether it's the business system, made it difficult for them. So having an organization that can help enact policies that give greater language access, policies to enforce against discrimination, I think is important. And that is honestly always in the back of my mind when I do the work that I do.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate you sharing with us your your lived experiences because I think too often, and again I blame the media in large part for that as well as politicals that use immigration for their own agenda. We need to normalize people like you because you're not the exception. In fact, there are many people like you, immigrants, that are contributing to the fabric of this country, and there's a lot of value in having people like yourself with different backgrounds that are providing incredible insights across many different aspects of society. So I do appreciate you. You are inspirational and aspirational. In the short time that we've spent together, we've covered many different subjects. And before I say goodbye and let you go, is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to mention?
We've covered a lot of ground here. I think the only thing I would say is that it's going to take all of us. And I appreciate, Hugo, you weaving in your own personal experiences and talk about your lived experiences as a Hispanic Latino American. Because likewise, that's a very diverse experience. Yeah, I know that, right? And sort of how we all work together recognizes our differences, but how those could be strengths as well. Because so often, all of our communities are also pitted against each other, right? It's like, well, the Asian Americans are stealing jobs from so and so and so and so. Like the affirmative action debate is one of those places that like there is friction because Asian Americans were being told that somehow we're being discriminated against when all the statistics show otherwise. So really becoming better educated about all of this, having those personal discussions that you and I have even we've had right now, but we're encouraging others to have. I think those are the things that are going to be so important over these next 2, 4 years when there are going to be forces that are going to try to divide us.
Absolutely. Very important to celebrate what makes us unique as well as bridge build in identifying what we have in common. And as you said, in the next 4 years, and even beyond, it's just so
Yes.
important to break, chip away at walls that we don't construct for ourselves, that others construct for us because they understand that in unity there's power. And I think while absolutely there are specific issues that are unique to the Latino community, to the Black community, to the Asian community, fill in the blank community, there are also things that we have in common. And when we show up together in the room, well, then that's a powerful force. John Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for spending this time with us as well. Conversation and collaboration nurture a well informed citizenry. Amugo Balta.